Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the English Channel was a churning gray expanse of steel and storm. The sky hung low and heavy, smeared with mist and gun smoke from the bombardments that had already begun pounding the coast of Normandy. Out there, amid the wind and spray, small landing craft tossed like toy boats against the swell. Inside them, huddled and soaked, were men of the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions, their mission one of the most dangerous of D-Day, to scale the towering cliffs of Pointe du Hoc and silence a battery of German guns that could slaughter thousands landing at Omaha and Utah beaches. The men had studied photographs and models for weeks. Pointe du Hoc, a rocky promontory jutting into the sea between Omaha and Utah, was believed to house 6 155mm French guns, capable of covering both beaches with lethal fire. The Rangers knew every contour of those cliffs, every suspected bunker and casement. They also knew that climbing those cliffs under fire was near suicide. But if the guns weren't destroyed before the landings began, the entire Allied invasion could bleed out in the surf. Colonel James Earl Rudder, a former Texas A&M professor turned battle-hardened officer, was leading them. At 37, he was calm, methodical, and utterly unshakable. He had told his men the truth, that many would not come back. "We've got to do it," he'd said simply. "Our boys on the beaches are counting on us." The Rangers had been scheduled to land at 6:30 a.m., but the sea had other plans. The channel's fierce currents pushed their landing craft miles off course. Heavy waves smashed against the hulls. Men vomited, clung to ropes, and tried to protect their gear from salt water. The British crewed landing craft fired grappling hooks tied to rockets, designed to shoot ropes up the cliffs so the Rangers could climb. But everything depended on timing. They had to hit the exact point, at the exact moment, in the exact order. As the naval bombardment lifted, the cliffside vanished under a rising curtain of smoke and dust. To the Rangers' horror, they realized they were late. The naval guns had stopped firing. The Germans had survived. Somewhere up there, in the ruins and trenches, enemy soldiers were waking, looting their weapons, and taking aim. At last, around 7:08 a.m., the first wave of landing craft ground against the rocks at the base of Pointe du Hoc. Machine gun bullets ripped into the boats immediately. Water frothed and turned red as the Rangers leapt into the surf, some chest deep, some already wounded. "Up the cliffs!" Rudder shouted over the chaos. The men fired their rocket lines, and the ropes hissed upward. Some caught on ledges, others slipped free. Many ropes burned when the wet powder failed to ignite, forcing the Rangers to find new ways up. The Germans above rolled grenades down the cliffs. They burst among the climbers, showering them with shrapnel. Rifle fire rained down, striking men who dangled helplessly against the rock face. One Ranger, Sergeant Leonard Lommel, later said it felt like climbing into hell itself. The ropes swung wildly. The cliffs were slick with rain, mud, and blood. But the Rangers kept going, hands blistered, rifles slung on their backs, knives between their teeth. The U.S. Navy destroyer Satterlee, dangerously close to shore, opened fire directly at the German positions on the cliff edge. Its shells screamed just overhead, exploding only yards from the Rangers' ropes, close enough that fragments of rock and steel showered down. But those blasts saved lives. They kept German heads down long enough for the first climbers to reach the top. When the first Rangers crested the ridge, they found devastation and confusion. The bombardment had torn the ground into a lunar landscape of craters and shattered bunkers. Smoke stung their eyes. There was no sign of the 6 great guns they'd come to destroy. Only decoy telephone poles had been set in their concrete mounts. For a few long minutes, no one understood. Had the Germans hidden the guns elsewhere? Was the mission a failure before it began? Colonel Rudder organized his scattered men and began pushing inland. "Find those guns," he ordered.
They moved through hedgerows and ruins, fighting brief skirmishes with pockets of German defenders. It was then that two Rangers, Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, stumbled upon a dirt road leading south from the point. There, hidden under camouflage netting and branches, sat all 6 155mm guns, fully intact, pointed toward Utah Beach and ready to fire. Lommel and Kuhn didn't hesitate. They had only grenades and thermite charges, designed to melt through metal. They set to work quickly, smashing the guns' aiming mechanisms and pouring molten iron into their gears. One by one, they disabled all 6 weapons. The Rangers had completed their mission. The guns of Pointe du Hoc would never fire a shot on D-Day. But their ordeal was far from over. Back at the point, the Germans counterattacked fiercely. Rudder's men were vastly outnumbered, roughly 200 Rangers against hundreds of enemy troops entrenched in bunkers, trenches, and nearby villages. The cliffs offered no easy retreat. They were trapped atop the very promontory they had conquered. Ammunition ran low. Communications were sporadic, with radio sets damaged or drowned by seawater. For 2 days, the Rangers fought off wave after wave of assaults, relying on captured weapons and sheer determination. The Germans rained mortars onto their positions. Men dug into shell holes for cover, crouching behind the concrete remains of casemates. Some Rangers crawled from crater to scavenge ammunition from the dead. By the second day, the wounded lay everywhere, and medical supplies were nearly gone. Rudder himself was wounded twice, but refused evacuation. He knew if he left, morale would break. Down below, ships in the channel watched helplessly. They could see the fighting, but had no clear picture of who held what. Reports trickled in that the Rangers had been wiped out. It was only when the 5th Ranger Battalion, having fought its way from Omaha Beach, linked up with Rudder's survivors on June 8th that the truth became clear. The position still held. Out of roughly 225 men who had stormed Pointe du Hoc, fewer than 90 were still able to fight when relief arrived. Yet the guns were gone, and the high ground was in Allied hands. General Omar Bradley later called their assault one of the most heroic actions of the war. The cost was staggering. Men who had trained for months, who had memorized every inch of those cliffs, now lay buried in the soil they had captured. But their sacrifice had saved countless others. Had those 155mm guns opened fire on D-Day morning, the already catastrophic casualties at Omaha Beach could have doubled. Instead, the guns had been silenced before they ever spoke. Rudder's Rangers had accomplished the impossible. They had scaled 100-foot cliffs under fire, fought without resupply, and held against superior forces for 2 days. In the aftermath, survivors described the experience with quiet disbelief. They had fought not for glory, but because the mission had to be done.
In one crater, a group of exhausted Rangers shared a single canteen, passing it around wordlessly. Nearby, Lommel leaned against a shattered wall, his uniform blackened with soot. "We didn't have time to think," he recalled later. "We just knew we had to stop those guns." By the evening of June 8th, the beachheads at Omaha and Utah were secure, and Allied troops were pushing inland toward Carentan. The Rangers, spent and battered, were finally relieved. They had held their ground for 48 grueling hours, surrounded and cut off, yet never broke. Historians would later call the assault on Pointe du Hoc one of the defining moments of D-Day, a small operation with massive consequences. It was a symbol of the sheer determination that defined the invasion of Normandy. The Rangers' motto, "Rangers lead the way," was immortalized that day, as their courage cleared the path for thousands of others to follow. The cliffs of Pointe du Hoc still stand today, scarred with craters and littered with the remains of bunkers. The sea crashes endlessly below, and the wind whips through the grass, carrying the echoes of that morning in 1944.
Visitors who walk the grounds can see the shell holes, the concrete ruins, and the memorial at the cliff's edge, a granite dagger rising from the earth, honoring the men who climbed where no one thought they could. In Rudder's after-action report, he wrote with understatement that the operation succeeded in spite of formidable odds and numerous obstacles. Those obstacles had included everything from lost navigation to destroyed equipment to overwhelming enemy fire, yet his men had pressed on. One ranger's diary entry from that week reads simply, "We were supposed to take the guns. We did." What made Pointe du Hoc so daring wasn't only the steep cliffs or the fire they faced, it was the complete uncertainty. They had no guarantee the guns would be there, no way to retreat, no reinforcements within reach. Their success depended on courage, quick thinking, and blind faith in each other. When Lamel and Kuhn destroyed those guns with thermite, they did so on their own initiative. No one told them where to go or what to do. They just knew the stakes. During the chaos, the men used anything they could find. Some tied ropes together when their launchers failed. Others fired pistols while climbing, using their free hand. When ammunition ran low, they fought with knives and grenades. It wasn't textbook warfare. It was improvisation, desperation, and raw grit. Years later, Rudder would say he could still see it clearly. The smoke, the shouts, the sound of men clawing their way upward through bullets and stone. He said the men who went up those cliffs were heroes, every one of them. For 2 nights, those cliffs became their entire world. The Rangers dug foxholes in the soft, cratered ground. Rain poured down. Wounded men moaned in the dark, and German snipers prowled the edges. There was no sleep, no food, except what they could scrounge. Some of the wounded died quietly during the night. Others refused morphine so their comrades could have it. On the morning of June 7th, the Germans attacked again, this time from the nearby village of Grand Camp. Mortars landed among the craters, killing several men outright, but every assault was repelled. The Rangers, though nearly out of ammunition, refused to give ground. They moved silently through the fog, ambushing enemy patrols, stealing weapons, and melting back into the smoke. By the time reinforcements reached them, the Rangers had lost nearly 70% of their strength. They were covered in grime and exhaustion, barely able to stand. But their mission was complete. The guns were gone, and the beaches below were safe. When Rudder was finally evacuated for his wounds, he left behind a garrison of men who had done the impossible. The German commander who had defended the point reportedly told a captured Ranger later, "We could not believe you climbed those cliffs." Today, the name Pointe du Hoc stands alongside Omaha and Utah as a symbol of D-Day's courage. But for those who were there, it was simply survival. They didn't feel heroic. They felt lucky to be alive. In the decades after the war, surviving Rangers occasionally returned to the site. Standing atop the cliffs, they looked out at the sea they had once crossed in those tiny, battered boats. Some pointed toward the craters that still marked where their comrades had fallen. Many couldn't speak at all. In June 1984, 40 years after D-Day, President Ronald Reagan stood at Pointe du Hoc to commemorate the anniversary. In front of a crowd that included aging Rangers, he spoke the words that would echo around the world. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent." It was true. Against the full weight of the Atlantic Wall, the Rangers had shown that courage could overcome even the strongest defenses. The cliffs they climbed were not just of rock, but of fear and impossibility, and they conquered them both. The story of Pointe du Hoc remains one of the purest examples of bravery and sacrifice in military history. It wasn't a grand battle with tanks and air support. It was a knife's-edge struggle fought by a few hundred men with ropes and grenades against machine guns and gravity. When the sun rose on June 6, 1944, the fate of thousands on Omaha and Utah beaches rested on those cliffs. By nightfall, because of the Rangers' courage, the guns that could have shattered the invasion lay silent, burning from the inside out. The men of Pointe du Hoc didn't just take a hill, they ensured the success of D-Day itself. And as the waves continued to crash below that rugged point in Normandy, the echo of their climb, of ropes whistling through the air, of boots scraping stone, of voices shouting through smoke, still seems to linger in the wind.